You're listening to Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. O'Brien Communications is a corporate communications consultancy that can be found at o'briencommunications.com. To connect with us at Shaping Opinion, go to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you enjoy the podcast, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts. When you rate and review on iTunes, you help more listeners like you find us. In August of 1972, you were the first civilian forensic pathologist to examine the Warren Commission's forensic evidence. What did you find that day, and what couldn't you find?
What I found of utmost significance, to my great surprise, was the fact that the brain had never been examined and, as far as I could tell from the records, should still have been available somewhere. What really puzzled, surprised, and quite frankly troubled me greatly was that other people had known this for many years. The autopsy was done November 22nd, 1963. The brain was fixed in formalin, which is something that we do to increase the consistency of the brain, make it harder so that you can then section it serially in parallel fashion. If you attempt to do that with a fresh brain, which is really like a very thick, heavy liquid, it will fall apart. So you fix it in formalin, and you go back after 2 weeks to examine it. This is especially important, something like a gunshot wound, because then you can trace the trajectory. You'll see a hemorrhagic tract coursing through the brain. So this had been looked at by others, including the Ramsey-Clark panel, 1968, and so on. So my discovery maybe was something like Christopher Columbus, that he really was he the first person to ever tread foot on the North American continent? Obviously not, but he brought it to the attention of the world. So that's what I did, and it was a front page story on the New York Times, President's Brain Missing. That was a shock. And what it proves is not negligence, not something of an insignificant matter, a procedural deficiency. It demonstrates clearly, in and of itself, raises the very strong suspicion. It just stops short of proving, I would say, what I and my colleagues have been pointing out about the Warren Commission report's conclusion vis-a-vis Lee Harvey Oswald as a sole assassin and only one shot coming from the rear and so on. Why would the brain not have been examined? So that is the history, which was not my initial involvement in the Kennedy case, but which really made things much more dramatic and meaningful for me.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Dr. Cyril Wecht. He's a world-renowned forensic pathologist who has been involved in many high-profile cases, including the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. But the most high-profile case that he has studied and written a book about is the JFK Assassination, and the possibility that it was the result of a conspiracy. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Dr. Wecht about the events of November 22nd, 1963, the story that was told to the world, and the story that has started to emerge in the 55 years since. On a sunny day on November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed as his motorcade traveled through the streets of Dallas. That's the one thing that everyone can agree on. After that, the official explanation for what happened is only one of the stories that have resonated with people over the years. As history would tell it, as the president rode with the First Lady and Texas Governor John Connally through Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas, he was horrifically shot in the head, setting off a chain of events that is controversial to this day. Very quickly, the world would learn that the shooter was an employee of the Texas Schoolbook Repository. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald, and he was said to have perched himself at a window on the 6th floor overlooking Dealey Plaza when the president drove by. In 6 seconds, 3 shots were fired. In a matter of hours, police caught up with Oswald, and it was widely believed for all intents and purposes the case was solved. A few days later, Oswald was silenced as he was shot and killed by Jack Ruby. With President Kennedy deceased, President Johnson convened the Warren Commission to conduct a formal investigation into the assassination. By September and October of 1964, just short of a year after the assassination, the Warren Commission issued its report. It was 26 volumes of details and justification for their findings, which was that there was a single shooter, and that shooter was Lee Harvey Oswald. The commission concluded Oswald was operating on his own, and there was no larger conspiracy either within or outside of the United States. Dr. Cyril Wecht was the first civilian forensic pathologist to see the Warren Commission's forensic evidence, which would come in 1972. Before that, in 1964, he was among the first to study the 26-volume Warren Commission report from a forensic pathology perspective. Dr. Wecht, can you explain why you took on the task of going through the Warren report in 1964?
I was contacted by the program committee of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences sometime in the fall of 1964. The annual meeting is conducted in the third week of February every year. They have different sections in the Academy of the various forensic scientific disciplines, and they meet separately for much of the meeting, but there's a day that a plenary session is conducted. They pick a subject that will be of interest to as many of the different sections and all the forensic scientists as possible. So obviously, when you think that the Warren Commission report was issued around late September in 1964, it was an obvious choice for the plenary session subject of the 1965 Academy Conference. Those years, the conferences took place every year in Chicago. So I was asked if I would represent the pathology section. Each section that is involved with that particular subject has a representative to express her views from their respective perspective. And that took me to the Carnegie Library here in Pittsburgh, and pleasantly, not greatly surprised, because such a magnificent museum, they already had the 26 volumes. What was a shock and a horrible problem for me was the fact that there was no index. Can you just imagine? And that, by the way, also shows you another piece of the puzzle, another component of the very valid allegations that I and other WCR critic researchers have leveled against them. It shows you that this was designed to be a cover-up and then a continuing cover-up. Let's put out 26 volumes. Who's going to bother to read this?
About those 26 volumes, how would you estimate how many pages were in each one of those volumes?
I have them at home. I would say that each volume, I think, was probably maybe around 250, 300 pages. The point I want to make is this is not a very cumbersome task. Sylvia Marr, M-E-A-G-H-E-R, pronounced Marr, a wonderful lady. We became quite close friends, a divorced woman. She worked at the United Nations, and she lived alone in Greenwich Village. Sylvia Marr, back in 1966, 67, by herself, and this is pre-computer, she produced a directory, which is still used today. Can you imagine that one person was able to do it, but the United States government could not do it? What does that tell you? So that was my entrance into the case. I gave my paper in February of 1965 at the Academy, and The program was very enthusiastically received, and the interesting features about that presentation, that plenary session, were, one, FBI agents came there, not members of the Academy, sent by J. Edgar Hoover to hear what other people were saying. If he had it right, as of Sunday, the 24th, announcement on Monday, the 25th, that the case was all over. Oswald was now dead, and Hoover had no questions or problems or doubts at all. Why is he now, a year and a half later, sending agents to hear what other people have to say? Number two, interesting feature of that event was Pierre Fink, who was the third pathologist involved in the autopsy, called over from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, an Army guy, arriving late, not his fault, notified at the last minute by these two incompetent, totally inexperienced naval pathologists, Humes and Boswell, where the autopsy was being performed at Bethesda Naval Center. Pierre Fink was a member of the Academy. Humes and Boswell were not. They weren't forensic scientists. They weren't forensic pathologists. They had never done a gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers. Pierre Fink had dealt with military gunshot wounds, the Vietnam War, and so on. I had met him when I was in the Air Force, 1959-61, on two occasions when I went up to the AFIP for forensic pathology programs, and we had become friendly. So I was with him at lunchtime that day, and we said hello and everything, and then I obviously wanted to talk about the case, and so I asked him, Pierre, and so on, and he said with a very, very forlorn case, very apologetically, that he simply could not talk about it. He was not permitted to discuss the case. I knew Pierre Fink. He was originally from Switzerland, a very precise gentleman, very thorough, very efficient, and the door was shut. And again, this is another aspect of the case to look at and see the way the cover-up had been engineered from the very beginning and was, to this day, is a continuum of that cover-up.
Well, one of the things I know that you've said in the past, when you first saw those volumes, 26 volumes, and you searched through them as best you could, you came to a point in the volumes that you quoted the book, and it sort of was a great revelation for you, and this is the quote I think that you said, that in the volumes it said, serial sections of the brain are not made in order to preserve the specimen. Yes. And I know you said in the very beginning, you talked about not being able to find the brain in that gray box, that metal box. So you couldn't examine the brain, and you found out that it was actually a decision that the brain could not be, during the autopsy, I guess you could say, sliced in a way.
Well, 2 weeks later,
determine.
They went back, I think it was December 7th, as I recall. That was 2 weeks after that formalin fixation. And they did not then section the brain, which, of course, was a very important element of the case. And just think, later on, in 1968, with the Ramsey Clark panel, one member of which was the chief under whom I trained, Russell Fisher, chief medical examiner of Maryland, and then a forensic neuropathologist in conjunction with that committee from the same office, who was a skilled neuropathologist. Neither one of them saw fit to mention back then in 1968 that, we can't really give you a full opinion because we don't have the brain. Now, let's trace the track of the brain. In 1965, in April, this was the other thing that I found in my review there in August 72, that a memorandum was prepared. The government had come up with a totally nonsensical, ridiculous memorandum in which they started off with the conclusion that all the autopsy materials belonged to Jacqueline Kennedy, including the president's clothing and x-rays and studies and microscopic slides. Everything belonged to her like personal property.
Including the gun and the bullet.
Yeah, including the gun and the bullet and Connolly's clothes and everything else belonged to her. Well, that's, of course, nonsense. Ask any medical examiner in the country, ever, have they gotten all the materials together in an autopsy and called in Mrs. Jones, the widow of the deceased, and said, Mrs. Jones, we have a special package for you that we want to give you so that you can place it on your mantelpiece in memory of your deceased husband who was killed by gunshot fire. Of course. And it just these, see, even as I talk today, all these years, I become so angry, so passionate at what they did and how they got away with it and how they continue to get away with it now, 2019. This is unbelievable. So, but let me go back. So in that memorandum of transfer are listed all the things that Jackie Kennedy is now giving to the government, okay, as her gift. Guess what is listed in that memorandum of transfer? The brain. The brain is listed. So there we have April 65. The brain is present. Well, 1.5 years later, in October of 66, some of the government people, including a couple from the original pathology team and a radiologist, they go back to prepare now a confirmation of the gift to make a final complete list as they proceed. And there I'm holding in right hand one memorandum from April 65, in my other hand the October 66 detailed list. And guess what? The brain is no longer listed. In that 1.5 year period, the brain has been removed from the list. And just to follow up and finish now, admittedly, with some conjecture on my part, but I think quite reasonable conjecture, if, as the Warren Commission defenders and self-appointed sycophants like to say, the family took the brain and buried it and so on. Number one, if they were going to take the brain, they would have done so back then. They weren't going to keep it around so that it was still there in April of 65, number one. Number two, what would the family do with the brain? I'm sure the last thing in the world that any member of that family, Jacqueline Kennedy, who was a legal next of kin, would have ever thought of was, I want my husband's brain. It's disgusting to even think about that. And thirdly, if the family had ever done that, it was their legal right to have done so back then they simply would have said, and it would have been a one-line supplement or a one-line statement in subsequent years. The brain was buried by the family. Please, no more discussion about this. It's offensive to the family, and so on. That has never been done. No member of the family, not Robert Kennedy, not subsequently Ted Kennedy, not either of the grandchildren, the children of the president, Caroline or young John. Nobody ever said that. So I just mention that because people like to dismiss it in that fashion, saying, the family took it. Yeah, what proof do you have? In fact, if you just look at it logically and objectively, everything would argue against the family having kept that brain and buried it.
Well, one of the things that you've said in the past and why the brain is so important is that if you look at the brain, and I'm just reinforcing what you've said, you can determine the trajectory of the bullet, you can determine the angles, you can determine if it came from the front or the back, or if there were two wounds and they came from the front and the back. So these things all are very important to the work that you do.
Yes, absolutely. They're key. They're key. And just to repeat that, remember, as the brain hardens and you make the sections, then you just lay them out. And I don't mean to be crude at all, but the best metaphor, so people can readily understand this, the brain is like a well-done, soft-boiled egg at the time of autopsy. After it has been fixed in formalin, it now has the consistency of a hard-boiled egg. So just picture slicing a hard-boiled egg, you're making a salad, and taking out one section after another. Again, I mean, there is simply no better metaphor for a non-physician to comprehend what I'm talking about. And that was not done. That would have shown, no question in my mind, where the gunshot wounds, and I say wounds with an S on the end because there was more than one gunshot wound to the head, and indeed that one from the back and one from the front. And that's why that brain was never examined.
Well, let's go back and set the stage. I'm going to just go through our list and ask you a couple of questions. The facts of the case are that there was, and this is according to the Warren Commission, we can discuss whether it's true or not, but one bullet created 7 wounds in 2 men. If Lee Harvey Oswald got off 3 shots, did the Warren Commission find that only one of them hit its mark?
Yes, that is correct. That Oswald, according to the Warren Commission, fired 3 shots, and just think he's all the time in the world to aim and position for that first shot, but according to them, completely misses. Then another shot just grazes off, and his bounces off the street, and then one bullet, according to the Warren Commission, as you said, right, goes in Kennedy's back, out his neck, through Connolly's chest, in and out, back and front, piercing the right lung, breaking a rib, then re-enters the back of the right wrist, fractures the radius, one of the 2 long bones from the elbow to the wrist, exits from the front of the right wrist, re-enters the governor's left thigh. 7 wounds in those 2 men caused by one bullet. And then we can talk about that as you wish, but that's the single bullet theory.
And you call it the magic bullet theory.
Because when you look at how the bullet would have had to have moved horizontally and vertically in that pathway attributed to it, then indeed it is a very magic bullet.
Well, there's 2 observations about the single bullet theory that are fact. And number one is it wasn't the first theory. There were 2 theories prior to that.
Yes, that's correct. As a matter of fact, going back to the autopsy report, the autopsy performance, that night, those pathologists missed the fact that there was a bullet wound in Kennedy's neck. What they were looking at was a tracheotomy, an incision into the trachea for purposes of taking out carbon dioxide, giving oxygen, removing blood and mucus. You got to do this to keep somebody alive because the brain, which is in control ordinarily, is not functioning due to the injuries it has sustained. So you've got to take over the brain's functions. It wasn't until the next day that they learned about a bullet wound in the front of the neck. So on Friday night, this bullet that was reported to them in the autopsy room by the FBI, a call from the FBI in Dallas to the FBI in D.C., that a maintenance man, Roy Tomlinson, at the Parkland Hospital, trying to get to the men's room that afternoon after everybody had left, found a corridor blocked by stretchers. He bent down, and lo and behold, and it remains till this day, the bullet was on the stretcher, beneath the stretcher, but there was a bullet. So it wasn't until that night, so they go sick with that night, they concluded, incredibly, that the bullet that had entered the president's back, for which they could find no exit wound as of that night, Friday, November 22nd, that bullet had been forced back out through the same channel, the same small hole in the back, by resuscitation given to the president, compression of the chest anteriorly, forcing the bullet back out through, like a car going into the tunnel, and you just decide you're going the wrong way, you put it in reverse and back out. That's not what bullets do. So the next morning, when they called the surgeons in Dallas, these pathologists, they learned for the first time that there was a bullet hole in the president's neck. So now, less than 24 hours later, they say the bullet went into the president's back, came out through his throat, saw the starch white collar, and that was the end of its power and trajectory, and fell into the front of his clothing. So the stretcher bullet, as it is referred to, Commission Exhibit 399, the hero of the single bullet theory, the jokester in my magic bullet theory. So on Saturday, November 23rd, the stretcher bullet is now from Kennedy's neck. 5 months later or so, when they put together the single bullet theory, because now the whole scenario has to be Oswald did it, and the timing of the Zapruder film, which is the best photographic temporal evidence we have of this shooting, correlated with the time it takes to shoot this horrible piece of weaponry, a Mannlicher Carcano. They learned that it would have been impossible for Oswald to have gotten off the other shot. So that's what required them to put together the single bullet theory. The Warren Commission report came out in September, as I recall, of '64. The autopsy report then that came out around March, April of '64, they came to the conclusion that the one bullet had produced all those wounds. So to show you, going back to what we talked about, how the different reports varied based upon whatever was needed at that time by the investigative authorities.
Well, there was one thing about that bullet, too, that they found, and I've seen that you've used it on slide presentations. What was the condition of the bullet that they found?
The bullet that they claim produced all those wounds is a 6.5 millimeter, that's exactly a quarter of an inch, copper jacketed lead core military ammunition. It's about 1.25 inches in length and about 1/4 inch in diameter. The bullet in its pristine state weighs 161 grains. As it was found, it weighed 158.6 grains, a loss of 2.4 grains, which is exactly 1.5% of its original weight. And yet we know that fragments of the bullet remained in Conley, in his chest and in his wrist, which he took to his grave with him. I myself spoke with the chief OR nurse, Audrey Bell, sometime later, and she told me that she was given several pieces of the bullet by the surgeons who operated on Conley to give to the FBI. And yet we're told that this bullet, leaving fragments of itself, lost only 1.5% of its original weight. The bullet itself was completely pristine, intact. Only the base showed slight indentation from the impact of the firing mechanism, the explosion. But the nose, the cone, completely intact, although it destroyed 4 inches of Conley's right fifth rib and produced a comminuted, that means a multi-fragmented fracture of the radius. Keep in mind, John Conley was a 6'4" big bone Texan. For a bullet to shatter 2 bones like that and emerge pristine is unheard of. I challenged my colleagues in 1978 on the forensic pathology panel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, of which I was a member, one of 9, when they went along with the Warren Commission, although criticizing the autopsy to an even greater extent than I already had. But they said somehow, in the end, they got things right, their conclusions. So I asked them then, and here we are, 22 and 19, 41 years later or so, I'm still waiting for one such case from any of these major offices in the hundreds of thousands of autopsies that had been done and have been done since then, and so on, to come up with one bullet that has done something like this. No such case has ever been presented.
So we have a missing brain. We have an autopsy conducted by people that hadn't done a gunshot
autopsy ever.
And we have a single bullet theory. Now, a question for you about the single bullet theory. Did a forensic pathologist come up with that theory? Who came up with that theory?
Oh, I think the theory came from the people in charge, the government, Hoover and others. I don't know that they were necessarily the same people who had conspired to kill the president, but once it was decided that this was going to be a case attributed to one person, Oswald, they learned very quickly it wasn't the Russians or the Chinese or the Cubans. We have met the enemy and he is us. And it's decided that we're not going to tell the American public that Americans are responsible for this assassination, the overthrow of the government, coup d'etat in America. Then they began to run with the necessary scenario. And that's why, as we have talked, so many things were not done, things were covered up and continue to be covered up in the decades that followed. So there's no question that the scenario was given to the pathologist. Humes and Boswell had no experience. They didn't even have enough knowledge maybe to put together this scenario. They're told what the conclusion is, and now you take it. So it's like giving you, let's say, pieces of a puzzle, and some of them just don't fit. But you're told a picture of the final puzzle. This is it. But you have some pieces that don't fit. What are you going to do? Well, here are scissors, and here's some Scotch tape, and here's some glue, and you begin to cut some pieces that fit. think about that. That's an interesting metaphor I just thought of as we speak here today. That's a perfect metaphor. You've got, don't ask me any questions. Give me a final, complete puzzle. And here are the people. But, sir, the piece, I don't want to hear that. You make it work. And that's what happened.
Now you're talking about not only the autopsy and the crime and the investigation, but the suspicious, I guess, I'll put quotes around it for now, the cover-up quotes. But going back to that Jacqueline Kennedy gift to the Warren Commission, which was all of the evidence that is unusual. But there was a condition on that, and it was that nobody was allowed to see it for 75 years, except there was an exception, and you were part of that exception. After 5 years, a pathologist with a serious historical purpose could request access. You were that pathologist, and you...
I applied 5 years later. Burke Marshall, who had been assistant attorney general, was made the executor of that agreement. Now, 5 years later, he was a professor of law at Yale University. So I wrote to him and never got an answer. I wrote a second and a third time, never got an answer. Then I got contacted by Fred Graham of the New York Times, and he had learned about my inquiry, and he called me back, asked me if I had heard, and I hadn't. And he asked me if I would mind if he were to call Burke Marshall. He said, sometimes people respond to the New York Times. I said, please, Mr. Graham, feel free to do so. And he did. And finally, Burke Marshall responded. He still tried to keep me from doing it. He delayed for another half a year. Then he told me I had to go to New Haven to meet with him. Little did he know that New Haven is my second home with relatives and close friends from the time I was a baby. My mother's sister lived there. So I went up, and then finally I got in. And I was the first non-governmental related, non-governmental, sponsored forensic pathologist given access to the autopsy materials. And it was in August of 72, on a Sunday edition of the New York Times, on page 1, that story appeared, because Fred Graham had the exclusive, obviously, because of how he had helped me get in.
Well, and now we're talking about the physical evidence, but then there was another piece of evidence that anybody that's heard of the John F. Kennedy assassination is familiar with. And that's the Abraham Zapruder film. And you've studied that carefully. So you said, and we all know, that he wasn't a professional photographer. He used an 8mm home movie camera, which was a Bell & Howell model. And because it was that type of model, there was 18.3 frames per second. So you had, and the assassination took an entirety of 6 seconds. So that meant that he had to get a shut off every 2.3 seconds to successfully do this.
No, he had to get it off faster. The gun was shown in the hands of the most skilled marksman to require 2.3 seconds from shot to shot. The study of the Zapruder film shows that Connally is hit 1.5 seconds after Kennedy is hit first. And that was the problem, you see, that was presented to them, the correlation of the firing of the Mannlicher Carcano with the Zapruder film. And that was their seemingly impossible, incongruous physical hurdle to overcome, and that is what gave birth to the single bullet theory, courtesy of Arlen Specter, later to become U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, at that time junior legal counsel. In his brilliant mind, he's the one that solved the problem for them. He said, hey, what if one bullet produced all these wounds in 2 men? And that's when they seized upon the single bullet theory.
So Arlen Specter, who's a lawyer, who was a lawyer by training,
and
at
a
that
former
point,
district attorney or district attorney. I mean, yeah, he was smart. He was quite smart, and
But there's one thing he wasn't, and that is a forensic pathologist.
That's right. And we became friends later on. In fact, I even endorsed him in his re-election campaign in 2004, even though he was running as a Republican and I had been a lifelong Democrat. We became friends, and friendly enemies, so to speak, insofar as the Warren Commission report is concerned. But I am certain, and if God would give me the answer, I'd give anybody 100-to-1 odds that Arlen Specter came to believe and realize that he had given birth to a monster. that should have died at birth and not have lived, as the Warren Commission report has.
One of the things that you did, because everyone who studies this assassination, they look at that film, and you not only look at the film for what's on the film, but the timing of it all, and even you've studied acoustic evidence of it from other sources.
And just think, by the way, as you mentioned, I just want people to keep that in mind. You study the shooting of the president, the wounding of Connally, at 1/18th second intervals. There's not a word you can utter, a thought you can entertain, a movement you can make 18 times in 1 second. You can study the assassination of John Kennedy at 1/18th second intervals. Keep that in mind.
So I guess that leaves me with some questions, and we get to your theories. What do you think happened?
I believe that there were two shooters, one from the front, one from the back. I personally don't believe Oswald was a shooter, but I don't get hung up on that, because I don't care. I always say to my audiences, you want Oswald as a shooter? Fine. Just give me the second shooter and reopen the case, So two shooters, and the one from the front was behind the picket fence on the right grassy knoll. And that shot struck him above the right ear. And when you get back to the autopsy report and the subsequent examinations that have been made, as well as what the surgeons at Parkland Hospital saw that afternoon at the hospital, quite inconsistent with what the pathologists set forth in their autopsy, putting all together, there's no question, and we don't have time to get into all the radiological, physical, acoustical, photographic bits of evidence that undoubtedly corroborate this, that the president was struck and then in a fraction of a second he was hit by the other shot. The first shot did hit him in the back of the head, and then the next shot came in, and that was the fatal wound that struck him just slightly above the right ear.
If you believe there were two shooters, one of the things that leads to then is the word conspiracy, because if you have one, it can be an act of one person. If you have two, it's a conspiracy. And
people should understand the laws of every state and the federal criminal law. Two people, and the second person doesn't even have to be there. Let's say you and I decide to rob a bank. Only I just sit in my car and I drive you away. So two people involved in plotting, executing, covering up a crime makes it a conspiracy, technically speaking, and that's what we have here. And that was a problem for the government. See, people may say, well, what's the big deal? So there was a second shooter. The big deal is that that's a matter, then you got to reopen the case. You got to go to trial. And that was their problem. And when Oswald was conveniently killed by Jack Ruby, a would-be mafioso guy, and so on, then that ended the case and made it very easy for Hoover and the other people to move ahead and to make it a fait accompli.
In your mind, then, who are the suspects?
Well, the suspects are Americans, number one. I think that they were more likely former members. They could have still been actively involved, the CIA and military-type people. They're the only kinds of people that could have pulled something like this off. The important thing to keep in mind is that it wasn't, as I've already said, any foreign entity. Some people like to say, well, the mafia. No way in the world that the mafia by itself would have undertaken something like this or could get away with it and cover it up. No way. I think the mafia was used for different things, including Jack Ruby, to go in and kill Oswald. No question in my mind what that was all about. But it took people at the highest levels of government, and it took people who had a particular political agenda and ideology. What it was all about was not something of a personal nature or simply a Republican versus Democrat, but you got to keep in mind and know what was happening in America and in the world at that time. Civil rights and voting rights being proposed in this country, the great turmoil in the South, president coming up for re-election, which he certainly was going to win, undoubtedly. And then you've got the Bay of Pigs debacle, and Kennedy, angry as anything, tearing up a piece of paper in the presence of the majority Senate leader Mansfield, throwing it into the air and saying, this is what I intend to do to the CIA after he found out how they had lied to him about Bay of Pigs. You got Kennedy talking about pulling out of Vietnam, talking about warming up the Cold War with Russia. And these people who see America going to hell in a basket, do they sit back and say, well, only 5 more years of John, probably followed by 8 years of Bobby, wait till we come up. This isn't a ball game. Wait till the ninth inning of the baseball game or the second half of the basketball game or the third period of the hockey game. 13 years is a lifetime in the political evolution of a country. You can't beat the Kennedys at the polls. There's only one way to deal with this, and that is to eliminate John and later on Bobby. We'll talk about that another day. And that's what this was all about. So when you ask me who, I don't know the individual names, who were the shooters, but keep in mind who was around at that time. To be specific, who had been fired as CIA director by John Kennedy? Allen Dulles. Who was appointed to the Warren Commission? Allen Dulles. Who spends most of the time and essentially runs the Warren Commission? Allen Dulles. Chief Justice Earl Warren is pretty damn busy with the Supreme Court. 2 U.S. senators and 2 U.S. congressmen are very busy with their duties. That leaves Dulles and McCloy. So that's what you get. And then you got the CIA mystery guy, David Phillips, also known as... he had a pseudonym and so on. I mean, it's all there. So there's no question about it. It had to be people of that kind, with that ideology, really feeling that they had to save America. They were super patriots. They knew what was being done and what would occur and develop in this country, and they had to save America from the clutches of John and Bobby Kennedy.
Dr. Cyril Wecht, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. I enjoyed talking with you, and I hope that your listeners, whom I hope will continue to increase as the word gets out, wonderful discussion and great opportunity to review this extremely important matter in U.S. history.
To learn more about Dr. Wecht and his extensive amount of work on the JFK assassination, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion. Or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook group that you can join and a Facebook page, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.